morning we're continuing our sermon series through the book of Ecclesiastes as we went through this long passage. As I mentioned last week in the first sermon, Ecclesiastes is one of the books of the Bible that's known as wisdom literature, and many scholars believe that it was written by King Solomon. It's a book that's filled with questions. It's a book that kind of ebbs and flows, as you saw from last week if you were here, and this week in the reading of sort of like this picture. Darkness around, and yet there is light at the end of the tunnel. And we want to be thinking about living wisely in a broken world in our series. It's filled with questions, as I said, that humans have been asking forever, and it often uses this language that seems gloomy, skeptical at times. One writer has described the book of Ecclesiastes as a kind of back door that allows believers to have the sad and skeptical thoughts that we usually do not allow to enter the front door of our faith. Last week, I quoted Martin Luther, who said that we should read Ecclesiastes every day because it so firmly rejects sentimental religiosity. It rejects sentimental religiosity and in turn offers us advice on how to live wisely in this broken world. And it does so, as I said, by addressing really hard questions, the hard questions of life. And this morning, as we come to this text, we come up against the question of meaning. What is the meaning of life? What gives us meaning? The Greek philosopher Plato said that human beings are beings in search of meaning. We are in search of meaning. We all want to know what is the meaning of things. Susanna brought a shell from the beach and was showing to everyone, if you were at breakfast, listen to it. How did God do that? I don't know. What does it mean? Mystery there. But we want to know the meaning of things. What's the meaning of life? And for many in our culture, they would argue that, or answer that the meaning of life is simply that which we choose to give it. However, the Bible has a different answer for us. And in our text this morning, Solomon is on the search for the meaning of life, and he lets us in on this search, as it were, by explaining four ways or four tests that he experimented with to find meaning in life. The first test in his search for meaning was by seeking wisdom. We see in those first few verses, verses 12 through 18 of chapter 1. The second test in his search for meaning was pursuing pleasure in chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. The third test in the search for meaning was by living wisely. And the fourth and final test for meaning was in gathering possessions, which we'll see towards the end of chapter 2. So again, the four tests are seeking wisdom, pursuing pleasure, living wisely, and gathering possessions. Let's look at the first test that Solomon uses in his search for meaning. His first test is by seeking wisdom. Look with me again at verse 13 that says this, "And I applied my heart, to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven." However, immediately he comes to the conclusion that looking for meaning in life by seeking wisdom is, quote, an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Why is searching for meaning by seeking wisdom in this life an unhappy business? Well, he gives us the answer there in verse 14 where he says, "I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity, and all is striving after the wind." Now this phrase, under the sun, simply means living in the created world without taking God into account. And so Solomon says here that by observing everything that is under the sun, that is striving after the things of the world, is futile and empty. It is vanity and striving after the wind. If you were here last week, we looked at the first few verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We talked about the word vanity here, and it's used 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to keep coming back to this word vanity. And the Hebrew word translated as vanity literally means vapor or breath or smoke. And he uses it as a metaphor to describe how life is temporary. It is fleeting. It is like the wisp of smoke or vapor. Try to reach out and grab it, and you will come up empty-handed. And here in verse 14, he literally says that everything is like vapor. Not only that, literally it says everything is like vapor and like herding the wind. Herding the wind. Trying to capture vapor or smoke, as I already said, in your hand is pointless. And if you've ever tried to herd the wind, as in what a shepherd does with animals, it is pointless. You will also leave with empty hands. The conclusion here is that searching for meaning by seeking wisdom in the end will fail us. He confirms it in verse 15. Again, this interesting book includes these proverbs, and here he includes a proverb. And the first part says this: what is crooked cannot be made straight. In other words, wisdom cannot make straight what is crooked. Not everything can be explained in this world. We'll come back to the seashells as well. Not everything can be explained. We can try to explain things, and we think we understand everything, but not everything can be explained no matter how hard we try. As much as we have learned throughout the generations of human beings, asking questions and studying the world around us and studying the human body, there are many things that we simply do not understand. Like electricity. We really don't understand it, but we're glad it works. Because if you get beyond the moving of electrons, it's just theory. Many things we don't understand. The second part of the proverb is this: what is lacking cannot be counted. The closest thing to English, in an English sense of proverb, is one that we all know. You cannot count your chickens before they hatch. In other words, if you don't have it, you can't count it. It doesn't count. It's a pointless pursuit. In verse 16, Solomon says that he acquired great wisdom. He was wiser than all who came before him. He pursued knowing wisdom and knowledge and madness and folly, and concluded that it was like trying to herd the wind, trying to bring order to wind. And again, he confirms it again in conclusion with another proverb in verse 18, where he says, for in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. More wisdom brings with it more frustration. The longer you're in school, the more you understand you don't know a lot of things. More wisdom brings frustration because in the end, the world doesn't always make sense to us, and we cannot fully explain or understand everything in the world. And he also says that increasing in wisdom increases one's sorrow. Well, why is that? Well, because wisdom makes you more aware of things. Wisdom makes you more aware of pain that can't be explained. Wisdom makes you more aware of suffering in the world. And it increases sorrow. And so Solomon says that this search for meaning through seeking wisdom failed. The second test that Solomon uses in search for meaning is first few verses of chapter 2. You can see there, chapter 2, verse 1, we read, he says, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. Now, let me say here at the beginning in this verse here that Ecclesiastes, and indeed the rest of the Bible, is not opposed to pleasure. The pursuit of pleasure itself is not wrong. The problem here in Ecclesiastes is that Solomon, was seeking to find meaning in pleasure under the sun, as he says. Under the sun. That is, that he sought pleasure apart from God. He sought pleasure without taking God into account. And he makes it clear that here at the beginning, at this test, that pleasure did not satisfy the search for meaning any more than seeking wisdom did. It was also vanity. It was like a wisp of smoke. Pleasure at first glance seemed to give meaning and purpose to life. But in the end, it failed the test as well. And it will fail the test in our own lives. And it's not as though Solomon didn't really give it a really good try of seeking for meaning by pursuing pleasure. Verses 2 through 8, he lists all the pleasures of life that he tried. The first thing that he pursued was comedy, laughter. Now, I, for one, believe that comedy can be found in almost any situation in life. Almost. I was reminded at breakfast, Lindsay and Kelsey, that sometimes things just aren't funny. That is true. Not everything is funny, but most things are. A funny movie or a TV show may take our minds off of a hard situation for some time, but once the show is over, the hard situation is still there. One scholar paraphrases verse 2 as this: I concluded that laughter and merriment for their own sakes were mere madness. What did they accomplish to help me find lasting meaning and purpose in life? The second thing that Solomon pursued here was wine. Verse 3 says, I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom. Now we know that Solomon also wrote the Proverbs, and Proverbs 20 verse 1 says this: wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. That's why most scholars argue that Solomon doesn't have drunkenness in mind here. He wasn't drinking wine to forget about the troubles of life. Rather, it says he was trying to cheer himself with wine while his mind could still guide him with wisdom. Would wine give him more insight into the meaning of life in the short life that we have? Apparently not, because he moves quickly into how he pursued pleasure by making great works. Verses 4 through 6, you can follow along. Notice how selfish the pursuit of pleasure is. How selfish the pursuit of pleasure is. He writes, I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself great gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I did it all, and I did it all for me. Solomon essentially created a paradise on earth while he was king. Surely in paradise he would find meaning. No. In verses 7 and 8, he says that he acquired slaves. There was no shortage of servants, no shortage of help in this paradise that he created. He acquired more herds and flocks than of animals than anyone had had before. So there was no shortage of meat, no shortage of wool for clothing. He gathered silver and gold, the treasure of kings and kingdoms. There's no shortage of money. He gathered men and women singers, and there was no shortage of entertainment. Then he says he gathered many concubines. There was no shortage of sexual pleasure either. 1 Kings 11:3 says that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, some of you knew that trivia, and I see some of you are shaking your head at that too. It's mind-blowing. We know this was in direct violation of God's law, but in the eyes of the ancient world, and perhaps in the eyes of many in our culture today, Solomon had it all. He had money, he had possessions, all the pleasure that he could experience. In verses 9 through 11, Solomon tells us his conclusion of searching for meaning by pursuing pleasure. He says, I had more than anyone. I acquired everything that I found pleasing. I kept my heart from no pleasure. And after experiencing it all and pondering it all, he came to the conclusion that searching for meaning in life by pursuing pleasure was simply vanity. Simply a cloud of smoke. It was like trying to catch the wind. Pursuing pleasure failed the test of the search for meaning in life. Did he gain pleasure? Yes, but no meaning in life. Seeking wisdom failed in the search for meaning. Pursuing pleasure failed in the search for meaning. So Solomon goes to this third test. Perhaps living wisely, doing the right things, will give meaning to life. In verse 12, he writes this, so I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. And there seems to be a bit of a glimmer of hope here in verse 13, where he writes, then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. And he confirms this again by using a proverb. In verse 14, he says, the wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Now here, Solomon uses darkness as a metaphor for us to describe what he's talking about, a metaphor for spiritual blindness. He says that the fool is like a blind man who stumbles in the darkness. Right? We have acted foolish, and that is how we act. We know people who live foolishly, and that is how they act, like a blind man stumbling in darkness. But the wise man, on the other hand, he says, has eyes in his head and uses them to see in order to avoid disaster. At this point, it would seem that living wisely is certainly better than living foolishly. But then Solomon says, and yet I perceive that the same event happens to everyone. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool happened to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart, this is also vanity. For of the wise, as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come, all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. Death is the great equalizer. Living wisely is certainly better than living foolishly, but it will not save us from death. You can be the wisest, smartest, safest driver in Greenwood County. And it's dangerous out there, folks. You can be the wisest and safest driver, and someone can still run a stop sign or a traffic signal and end your life or the life of someone that we love. Death is the great equalizer. Living wisely may perhaps prolong our lives, but it will not ultimately save us from death. And this troubled Solomon. He confesses his response to this reality in verse 17, where he says, "So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and striving after the wind." Now, it's one thing to be disappointed in life. I don't know what's coming this week, but there'll be some disappointments for us. It's one thing to be really frustrated with life, but hating life is taking it to another level. Perhaps nowhere else in the whole Bible shows us the reality of a life without God. Again, remember, Solomon is looking at things from a purely human perspective. He's looking at things from the perspective of living under the sun, living a life without God in mind. So Solomon says he hated life when he considered that even the wise have nothing eternal to show for living wisely in this life. They also die, and they also will be forgotten. Perhaps you can relate to Solomon's honesty here in Eccelsiastes about hating life. Perhaps at some point in your life, you hated life for some reason. There are dark valleys in our lives, and left to ourselves and apart from God, they seem to have no end. Perhaps even today you hate life because of some sort of physical pain that overcomes your everyday life. Perhaps you feel as if you hate life because of some financial hardship. Perhaps you feel as if you hate life because of a broken relationship that just doesn't seem to be getting better. The truth is that if and when we look at things in our lives from an under-the-sun perspective, to use Solomon's phrase, that is to say that if we look at the circumstances and the difficulties without a good and loving God in view, then there is much to hate about life. But thanks be to God, He is there. He is nearer to us than the breath that we are breathing in the moment right now. Seeking wisdom failed in searching for meaning. Pursuing pleasure failed. And living wisely failed. And so there's one final test in the search for meaning, and it involves gathering possessions. Solomon points out that there is something left when we die, right? Our possessions do not die with us. We don't take them into the tomb like the Egyptians of old with us. They are left behind, whether it's a little or whether it's a lot. Something will be left behind to someone else. And Solomon quickly slams the door again on the possibility of any meaning to life. In chapter 2, verse 18, he says, "I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will be master of all for which I have toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This is also vanity." The working for and the gathering of possessions will not give us meaning in life. Solomon says at death we must leave those things behind, and we don't know what's going to happen to them. Frankly, we won't care what happened to them. Verse 22, he raises the question again. He says, what has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? And the answer is nothing. What do we gain? Nothing. And it's even less, if you'll notice there, even less is gained for the workaholic. Like Samson, who was filled with restless ambition to achieve and attain all that one possibly can in this life. It's a word of caution to us. In verse 23, he says, for all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night, his heart does not rest. This is also vanity. Once again, the test failed. Solomon found no meaning in life, no ultimate meaning in life by seeking wisdom, by pursuing pleasure, by living wisely, or by working and gathering possessions. Where does that leave us? Is there no meaning in this life? Is there no benefit at all to living on this earth that God has placed us? Well, yes. Thankfully, there is. And which brings us to the end of the text this morning. Some of you didn't think we were going to get there. Here we are. We see that meaning, true meaning in life, is found in enjoying God and in enjoying God's good gifts to us. It sounds simple. The problem is we don't often take time to do that. In verse 24, Solomon says, there is nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. That's interesting. So there is enjoyment in our toil. See, when God created human beings, he placed them in a garden, and he said, take care of it. Tend it. We were created for work. Now, the work certainly got harder when sin entered the world and turned it upside down and broken. Solomon here is encouraging us to find enjoyment in our everyday activities like eating and drinking as well as in our work. Well, why? Well, the answer lies in the rest of 24 and verse 25 where he says, this also I saw is from the hand of God. This is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat? Who can have enjoyment? Enjoyment in life is God's gift to us. Now, if we pursue enjoyment for the sake of enjoyment, then it'll vanish like the wind. That's vanity. But if we receive enjoyment in life as a gift from God, then it will make all the difference in our lives. God is not a God who wants us to be gloomy. He created us to know him and to walk with him and to enjoy him. Solomon concludes this section. Verse 23, we read this. It says, for to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting only to give to one who pleases God. This is also vanity and striving after wind. You see, God is pleased with people who recognize that behind the good gifts of this world that we can enjoy, that behind those gifts stands a sovereign, a just, and a good and loving God who delights to not only provide for us, but to give good gifts to us. We don't need chocolate chip cookies. We don't need steak, but those things are really good. I would argue we need steak. Anyways, to the sinner, God gives the work of gathering and heaping, he says. Gathering and heaping. As one scholar explains, Solomon has in mind someone who, though not wicked, has missed the point of life that God has given. And in this context, the sinner is one who seeks enjoyment simply in the gifts and not in the giver. And if you live this way under the sun, all you will end up doing is gathering and collecting, and you don't enjoy the God who's given the gifts. Solomon's message to us then is that since everything in life apart from God is meaningless, meaning in life is found in enjoying God and his good gifts to us. We should savor the moments that God has given to us by enjoying what we eat, what we drink, and the work that God has given to us to provide for those necessities. Wendell Berry, some of you may know the name, is a Christian writer. He's a farmer. He writes a lot about farming and agrarian life, and he writes a lot about food. He wrote an article entitled Pleasures of Eating. And in it, he writes this about eating. Eating with the fullest pleasure that is, that does not depend on ignorance, is perhaps the profoundest enactment of our connection with the world. In this pleasure of eating, he says, we experience and celebrate both our dependence and our gratitude. For we are living from mystery, from creatures we did not make and powers that we cannot comprehend. I wonder how often when we sit down for a meal that we take time to really experience and celebrate our dependence on God and our gratitude towards God. I mean, it's interesting how we're made, right? Our senses of smell and taste and even our eyes seeing things are intricately connected. The sensation of flavor is actually a combination of senses. You see, we aren't just creatures like animals that eat to survive. We do eat to keep the body going. We need fuel for this thing. But we are beings that were created with senses. And those senses enable us to enjoy food and drink. There's a reason why God gave us taste buds, to enjoy that which he has provided for us. Jesus also teaches us to savor God's good gifts and to be content with our lives, to receive food and drink as God's gift to us. In Matthew chapter 6, Sermon on the Mount, very familiar passage, Jesus says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about what you will eat or what you will drink. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and your heavenly Father feeds them. And are you not much more valuable than they?" It's a rhetorical question, obviously. Yes, we, as creatures made in the image of God, are more valuable than the birds. Do not worry, Jesus says, what what are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? What are we going to wear? Because the pagans run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But what? Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you. Those who do not acknowledge God, the giver of all things, miss the mark of life. They miss the meaning of life. But all who follow Jesus understand what the mark is. It's God. It's a good God. It is seeking him. It is seeking first the kingdom of God, and God will provide for our needs from the work that he has provided for us to be enjoyed as good gifts from him. Let me conclude with this. Westminster Catechism, some of you know, is written in the 17th century, is to teach the Christian faith in question and answer format. And the first question of the Catechism is this: what is the chief end of man? What is the chief end of man? What gives man purpose? What gives man meaning? And the answer that they formulated was this: man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. To glorify God and to enjoy him forever. The Apostle Paul put it this way, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, whether you eat or whether you drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. So let me ask you this morning, do you know God? Do you enjoy him? Are you simply interested in the gifts of work and food and drink, or are you interested in really getting to know the giver behind the gifts? You see, God sent Jesus, his greatest gift to us, to do that which we cannot do, to keep the law fully, to be perfectly obedient to the Father in keeping the commandments. And he sent Jesus, as Jesus went willingly, as we know, to the cross to pay the penalty for our sins. And Jesus rose from the dead so that we might be made right with God, so that one day all who turn to faith in him will defeat death as well. Solomon is clear that life lived under the sun, without God that is a life without meaning. But thanks be to God that Jesus came, that God sent Jesus to give us meaning in this life by making a relationship with the God who created us, the God who provides for us, the God who delights to give us good gifts for us to enjoy. He made it possible. And thanks be to God that it is possible that we can find meaning in this life because of who God is for us, that we can know him and enjoy him forever.